A few thoughts today around the sermon title, An Idiotic Business Model. Milton Friedman is a well-known economist from the Chicago School of Economics, and he received the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1976. His theory, which was published in the New York Times in 1970, which probably put it on the map, and it was the beginning of making it acceptable theory for economics, said that the goal and the purpose of business, it was conducted to maximize profit for the shareholders. I think it's familiar jargon. Most probably all of us know that, and most probably all of us at least believe that to a certain extent. That was probably, at least in the US and much of the capitalist societies across the world, probably the going and accepted philosophy around business for quite a while. Jack Welch came along and said, no, that's a dumb idea. At least equally as important is the bottom line, short-term profit. He said that maximizing shareholders' wealth or profit should be a result, not the goal. So he said, if you maximize short-term profit, if you always guard your bottom line and make sure that you make a short-term profit at all costs, then you will eventually maximize, or naturally you'll maximize as a result also shareholders' wealth in the long run. I think we have noticed in many ways that Jack Welch wasn't necessarily correct in that, or at least some of us may think that way. If we would venture into trying to establish or figure out what Jesus' economic philosophy was, what Jesus thought about economics and finances and so forth, it can become an interesting exercise. And if we are willing to decontextualize texts and phrases and paragraphs in our sacred text, we can, like with everything else, find what we want there. We can have the Bible and Jesus say what we think he should be saying to fit our views. But having said that, it is clear that Jesus did not sit down to write a treatise on economic philosophy. I think it is clear from many of his teachings that we can accept as valid teachings of Jesus himself and not things that were added later on or put into his mouth by other people, other authors, that he was favoring, and very prominently so, a just society, also in economic sense, an inclusive economic model. We read these few verses in the book of Luke at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, when he was visiting his hometown Nazareth, and he went to the synagogue, and it was probably a big day for the synagogue. One of the hometown kids reading the scripture there, now having gained the reputation as a wise teacher. So Jesus read from the book of Isaiah, and we hear familiar words. Jesus said he came to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, and recovery of the sight of the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to declare the year of the Lord's favor. Now, that little nugget at the end, the year of the Lord's favor, that is quite something that I think we easily gloss over, and that actually is a radical saying there. Both in Luke and in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah 61, verse 1 through 4, we can find these same words. Is based on the book of Leviticus, Leviticus chapter 25, the first 7 verses, and later on verse 10 and 4 onward as well. And the book of Leviticus there speaks about economic principles that was prescribed for ancient Israel. And there were 2 interesting principles mentioned there. The first one is the Sabbath year, and the second is the Jubilee year. Now, the Sabbath year was every 7th year, and it was a year when all the fields had to lay fallow. No field was farmed, to give the land time to recover. So a very good agricultural practice to preserve the land, but it was also a time when, in the Sabbath year, everybody was allowed to glean from the harvest that would emerge from the previous year's sowing that took place. The Jubilee year was, as I said, something radical. It happened every 49 years or 50 years, depending on on the count of which scholar you base your view. It was a year when the same thing happened as in the Sabbath year. Nothing was farmed, no field was farmed. But that's okay, I think. It's like the Sabbath year. And most people say, well, it was the 49th year because you cannot have 2 years without any harvesting. That would create too much hardship, famine, etc. But whatever the case may be, what was strange about this year, the Jubilee year, was that all Hebrew slaves would be set free. And that could also perhaps be palatable to us, but the radical thing is this, that say in the Jubilee year, every 49 or 50 years, all land would revert to its original owners. All land ownership would be restored to its original owners. Now that's a loaded phrase right there. It talks about restoration, and it brings into play all the questions about where do you draw the line to decide these are the original owners, or how far do you go back in history, etc., etc. But leaving that set of difficult questions aside, it's a nice fireside conversation or an adult Christian ed opportunity to discuss that. Just looking at the principle, it is something that if you look at it from the perspective of Friedman or Welsh or any other economist of our day, would say that's nonsense. It's idiotic to push that reset button to eliminate all debt on land and just give it back to whoever possessed it. Therefore, the question is valid to pose whether this really happened and whether this was really practiced in Israel. And again, like with everything else in the Bible, there are many different schools of thought around this. In essence, the two schools of thought is, no, this was an ideal, it never was really implemented. And the other thought was, no, it actually happened. They really did this. So that you had a generational reset of conditions, so that you created, that you did not create a permanent class of poor people that had no probability of living a dignified life where they could exist like everybody else without living in squalor and poverty. Walter Brueggemann says that it doesn't matter whether it actually happened. He says here we have the confluence of the theology of the covenant, the covenantal God, saying to his people of the covenant, to Israel, this is how you should run your economy, according to these principles. If you look at it, it was probably a practice that originated and that perhaps existed in the time of the 12 tribes when they moved into Canaan. And when it was specifically formulated, these ordinances, these commands, these laws, to see that the subset of more or less the clan in the tribe would always be the owner of the land as was given to them in the time of the 12 tribes. It's an interesting question, but as far as I'm concerned, it's not that important. I think that in this principle of the Jubilee here, we find principles or core tenets of the Christian tradition embodied. We find the principle of grace, of meritless receiving, of being given something without you deserving it, just because I'm giving it to you out of grace. The principle of forgiveness, I forgive you, out of grace. The principle of a new beginning, of starting with a clean slate, that we find expressed, for instance, in the death of Jesus, where he died, and at least for some of us, that is a symbol of renewal after forgiveness, and then the open grave signaling the renewal again and a new beginning. We find the principle there in this Jubilee of an inclusive economic existence, including everybody, saving the population in the long run, as was central to the teachings of Jesus, and that we also profess through our participation in communion, that the meal as the utmost expression of equality and acceptance, that it is also present there. On Friday, it was the celebration of Juneteenth. Now that was a strange word. I remember arriving in the US and reading this strange word and then having quite some difficulty finding out what it is about. what it stood for. And it is fascinating to read about it, also depressing. And I was amazed to read, and I only discovered it a few weeks ago. I know about Juneteenth, but I never realized that it took 2 years before the proclamation of emancipation was actually implemented in the state of Texas. But what was even more surprising to me when I did some reading this past week, was to find out that Texas wasn't the last state to abolish slavery. Even after the Declaration was read there, 2 states in the Union, Delaware and Maryland, continued with that practice. I have it for at least a year, but I may be wrong. 2 years that it took for reality of liberation, of emancipation to arrive on the ground in Texas is a long time. For a slave in Texas, it must have been a lifetime or an eternity. It took even longer for equality and racial justice to arrive in our nation. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a century later, with his work, made some headway. Some change happened. He identified 3 evils in society: racism, war, and poverty. In 1967, the year before his death, he had a conference with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And they formulate the campaign, or planned the campaign, that they called the Poor People's Campaign. And they planned a march in June of the next year on Washington to bring to the legislature, to Congress, the urgency of the need to address poverty in the nation among African Americans, but across the board. We all know he was assassinated, but Ralph Abernathy led the march, the Poor People's Campaign on Washington. I'm not so sure that it had any lasting result. You may have read or may have skipped it, the snippet of news around the Poor People's Campaign, because this weekend was a digital march on Washington by the Poor People's Campaign. I joined the movement, I don't know, a year, 18 months ago, when it was formed, and I spent Saturday morning 3 hours, and the Saturday morning is a very precious thing to me, but I dedicated some time to logging on and experiencing the virtual campaign. And it consisted of mainly of the stories of people across this beautiful land. from the coal regions of the Appalachian Mountains to the farmlands in Wisconsin and Oklahoma. From Mississippi to California to New England and Maine. All across this land, stories of people who have been suffering and are suffering the indignity and humility of being poor in this wealthy nation. I do not want to dwell on it because it was an emotional and actually a traumatic experience for me to be confronted with it visually and to hear them in their own words, their authentic stories of this is what happened to me, this is the result of it, this is where I find myself now. 140 million Americans, of which 40 live permanently below the poverty line and another 100 on that line, with just one emergency like a flat tire separating them from entering into poverty. The motto of this campaign is a national call to moral revival. And one of the striking things that one of the leaders said yesterday around this national call to moral revival was, this campaign is not about left or right. It is about right and wrong. It is not partisan political, but it is deeply political because this movement addresses the centers of power and asks that we do what is right so that our fellow Americans no longer need to live or exist rather than live in an undignified way. It is in essence about our fellow Americans and granting them systemic compassion. The passage that we listened to from the book of Ezekiel is a very interesting one. It's a passage that is popular with preachers because, it's got that beautiful imagery of a heart of stone being removed and replaced by a heart of flesh, God healing Israel, and then the beautiful poetry about the promises of the restoration of the land. It is beautiful, a lovely passage, but it's got a very disturbing phrase in there as well, a verse that is disturbing. Something hidden like the year of the Lord's favor in the words of Jesus that Luke quoted. Because it speaks about the good things that God will do. And then the verse where God says, Israel, it is not for your sake that I'm doing this. And God says, I'm doing it for my name, for my holiness, because Ezekiel was a priest that went with the exiles to Babylon. So God's holiness, as it is represented by the temple, was extremely important for Ezekiel. So he said, the God of Israel, so disappointed and actually disgusted, to use his words, with Israel, will restore Israel because God is embarrassed that God's people do the things that he describes. And therefore, for God's sake and his name, restoration will take place. God almost said, Israel, I've grown tired of you. I've had enough. I'll not leave you alone as my people, but I will restore you for my own sake. And yesterday, while I was watching that Poor People's Campaign, that long virtual event, the thought came to me, where is our cutoff point? As God's people, and as we like to say in many circles, God's own country and God's nation, God's people. How long will we tolerate inequity? How long will we condemn the poor to be humiliated? Let us restore the heart of flesh. Let us demand from Washington. Let us demand from the powerful people that run our economy. Let us demand from all centers of power that we want compassion expressed in corporate sense, in systemic sense, so that the work that Jesus spoke about the restorative system, an inclusive system, can find expression among us. I still believe we have the collective moral capital. And I want to ask you, if you have skipped that bit in the newsletter about the Poor People's Campaign, go back and read it, and please log on and look and listen and learn, and may God's Spirit move you to act. And if you haven't received the newsletter, you're perhaps just logging in. Google the Poor People's Campaign. And if you have time, or let me rather say make time tonight, to join another virtual event of that campaign. Let us heed this national call to moral revival, because the injustice of poverty that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. also identified as one of the evils is still with us. And the good news of the American dream has not reached 140 million of our fellow citizens. Let us be people with a heart of flesh and bring back the principle of the here of the Lord's favor.